It just keeps on getting worse for Russia. Crimea was already in dire straits. Ukraine's bombardment of the R-280 had turned a logistical artery into a highway to hell. Now it gets even worse. Ukraine is systematically targeting every single bridge that leads into Crimea. Giant fireballs are engulfing them all. Supply vehicles are being swatted like flies by Ukraine's drones. The Russian snake has just been decapitated. And there's one bridge that has been hit harder than most. It's not the one you're thinking of. 50 Russian vehicles drove onto this bridge. A few minutes later, poof, they were gone. On June 11th, Ukrainian forces did what they do most nights in the occupied territories of their country. They located targets and sent powerful mid-range drones to strike. Only this time was different. Ukraine wasn't trying to hit air defenses to take out troop concentrations. It had the last functional overland bridge leading into Crimea in its sights. The Armyansk crossing in the Kherson Oblast is Russia's saving grace. After a devastating campaign by Ukraine, that crossing is the only bridge left standing that provides Russia's forces with a direct overland route into Crimea via Ukraine. Trucks and fuel tankers have been rerouted across that bridge, creating a logjam of targets that were just waiting for Ukraine's drones to find them. Spoiler alert, Ukraine found its targets. The night of June 11th saw Ukraine unleash a lethal storm of drones all over the Armyansk crossing. Spearheaded by the 1st Separate Assault Regiment of the Ukrainian military, the strike did more than damage Russia's last land bridge into Crimea. It crippled every single vehicle that was trying to use it. Once the dust had settled and the smoke had cleared, the numbers came in. About 50 of Russia's supply vehicles have been destroyed in minutes. A single overnight strike left them burning on the only Crimean bridge that Russia has left. Russia should have seen this coming. Putin's patsies probably knew exactly what was going to happen. Their problem was that Ukraine had left them with no choice. The only reason so many supply trucks were taking the Armyansk crossing in the first place was because of what Ukraine had done to another bridge in the Kherson Oblast just a few days before. Russia had been forced to divert its trucks or else leave them in Kherson, where they couldn't sustain Crimea. Putin might now be wishing that he'd simply left the trucks be, but he couldn't. He's caught in a catch-22 of Ukraine's making, as he needs to supply Crimea, but he can't risk trying without Ukraine's drones having a field day against the trucks that are all being sent to follow a single route toward the peninsula. The trap was set. Ukraine sprung it masterfully. To understand the genius of Ukraine's latest move, we need to take a trip to the Chonhar bridge. Like the Armyansk crossing, where Ukraine just brutally cut down 50 Russian vehicles, the Chonhar bridge was a logistical artery connecting Crimea to the Kherson Oblast. Scratch that, it was the logistical artery. A series of strikes in June did the damage. Now, per the 1st Separate Assault Regiment commander Dmytro Filatov, the Chonhar bridge is no more. Ukraine's strikes against the bridge led to critical damage, meaning the Chonhar bridge can no longer support any civilian or military traffic. Satellite images from the scene tell the full story. In before and after pics, we see what critical damage really means. In the before picture, the bridge is intact. In the next one, it's gone. Lost to the drone strikes that Ukraine has carried out with impunity. Russia has already deployed a makeshift pontoon crossing to substitute for the bridge, but that isn't going to work out. Ukraine could hit that crossing at any time, and it's nowhere near large enough to sustain the type of traffic needed to keep Crimea supplied by way of Kherson. After the Chonhar bridge was damaged, the enemy concentrated a large number of trucks carrying military supplies on the Armyansk route, Filatov reveals. And that brings us nicely back to the bridge where Ukraine just crippled 50 vehicles. Filatov was one of the leaders of that operation, and he gave us some interesting insight into just how quickly Ukraine is now able to go from making a decision to conducting an attack. Only 6 hours passed between the decision and the strike. We had already anticipated that the enemy would eventually shift traffic to alternative routes, so operations against the Armyansk corridor were prepared in advance, Filatov says. We told you that Ukraine had forced Russia into a catch-22 situation. What we saw on June 11th was Ukraine closing the trap around Russian supply vehicles that had been left with no other choice than to bunch up on a bridge they were never supposed to take. But for the jaws of Ukraine's trap to snap shut, more than the destruction of the Chonhar bridge was needed. Filatov points that out, noting that 50 Russian supply vehicles now burn on the Armyansk crossing because of the hard work of other units carrying out strikes against Mariupol and the road into Berdyansk. What we see here is lethal coordination, the ability to strike multiple targets at once, forcing Russia to split its defenses to the point where they're simply unable to cope. Filatov and his unit took advantage of the diversion, and their drones did the damage. Half a century of strikes has just left Crimea more isolated than ever before. Ukraine has officially confirmed the attack, and footage has been released, showcasing what its drones did. Over and over, we see videos shot by the strike drones themselves as they descend onto their targets. Bridges are hit, vehicles are left burning. These strikes are precise and, more worryingly for Putin, conducted against key targets that appear to be almost completely undefended. For Russia, what's even more worrying is that this isn't a one-off event. Ukraine has been carrying out a clear campaign against Russia's logistics, leading to it breaking daily records for the destruction of supply vehicles and fuel tankers. May 29th seemed to mark the kicking off of Ukraine's campaign, as it destroyed 483 of Russia's supply vehicles in 24 hours, a single-day record for the Ukraine war at that point. Since then, Russia's vehicle casualties have been in the hundreds practically every single day. June 14th provides a perfect example as UATV reports that 401 Russian vehicles and fuel tankers were left burning by Ukraine's drones. There are fireballs all over the land routes leading into Crimea, and they're having a devastating effect on Putin's attempts to maintain his grip on the peninsula that he stole from Ukraine back in 2014. 50 vehicles down on one route is impressive, but it's really just a highlight in a weeks-long campaign that has disabled thousands of Russian vehicles. What we've just seen on the Armyansk crossing is Russia paying the price for being forced to reroute its logistical traffic. But that isn't the full story. The real problem for Putin is this: it's not just the Chonhar bridge that Ukraine has destroyed, forcing the use of the Armyansk crossing in the first place. 4 of Russia's land bridges to Crimea have been taken out, and it all happened in a single night. Worst of all for Putin, it's not even Ukraine that is crowing about what it just did. Hiding somewhere in Kherson is Vladimir Saldo, the head of the puppet government that Russia has installed in the occupied regions of the oblast. As he trembles, terrified about what Ukraine is going to do next, he has taken to Telegram to reveal just how extensive Ukraine's strikes against Russia's logistical arteries are. Last night, the enemy attacked bridges over the North Crimean Canal near Preobrazhenka and Mirna, a road bridge on the Perekop-Armyansk highway, and a bridge near the village of Stavki, Saldo said on the social media platform, revealing the full scale of Ukraine's operation. He then descended into the usual Russian nonsense of trying to downplay Ukraine's achievement. He claims there is some damage. Saldo, 50 burning vehicles, a completely shattered Chonhar bridge, and the knowledge that Russia's supply trucks can't take any route to Crimea without being targeted by Ukraine's drones is a little more than some damage. The Kherson puppet governor also claimed that Russia's air defenses destroyed 45 of Ukraine's strike drones during the June 11th attack. No word about how many drones those defenses missed. Perhaps it was all Ukrainian drone debris taking out vehicles and crossings overnight on June 11th. Could it get any worse for Putin right now? If you know Ukraine, you already know the answer to that question. On top of this June 11th blitz, Ukraine spent the previous 4 days choking off all of the northern routes that Russia has to the Crimean peninsula. There are the strikes against the Chonhar bridge, which we mentioned earlier. However, Ukraine has also hit the land bridge connecting Henichesk and the Arabat Spit, which was taken out of commission on June 10th. That's what forced Russia into diverting traffic to Armyansk and another crossing in Perekop. Both were hit on June 11th. Russia is running out of time. Bit by bit, Ukraine is chopping away at the head of the Crimean snake. That head is now hanging on by a thread, and dollars to donuts, Ukraine will be hitting every remaining route that Russia has through Kherson and into the peninsula until they're all rendered useless. Soon, Russia's military won't be able to divert its supply vehicles. They'll be left at a standstill as Ukraine's ruthless and perfectly coordinated campaign isolates Crimea. But before we dig deeper into what's happening on the Crimean peninsula, this is a quick reminder that you are watching The Military Show. If you haven't already, remember to subscribe to the channel so you never miss one of our videos. Every single strike that Ukraine is conducting, be it against bridges or vehicles attempting to cross those bridges, has a purpose. Ukraine is cutting off the logistical arteries that feed into the Crimean peninsula. It all started with the R280 road, which Ukraine spent much of late May and June transforming into a literal highway to hell for Russia's forces. Running from Russia's Rostov-on-Don through occupied Melitopol and Mariupol and onto Crimea, that route is now mostly closed to civilian traffic. As for freight and military traffic along the roads, it isn't doing so well. At its peak, around 3,800 freight vehicles drove across the R280 every day, which gives you some idea about the scale of the logistical operation that Russia was running. Now, according to the commander of Ukraine's unmanned systems forces, Robert Brovdy, traffic along this key stretch of highway has fallen by a dramatic 71%. Russia now only risks sending 1,100 vehicles per day, rather than 3,800. The knock-on effects are being felt in Crimea. And that's all part of Ukraine's plan of striking deep inside the Russian rear to cripple the logistical network that enables Putin to maintain his control over the peninsula. As the Institute for the Study of War put it on June 12th, continued Ukrainian strikes against Russian GLOCs will likely have cascading battlefield effects and may complicate Russian preparations for offensive operations. GLOC stands for Ground Lines of Communication, and it shows us that there's another dimension to Ukraine's mid-range strikes. As trucks burn and roads are cut off, Ukraine is also taking out the communications between Crimea and the occupied territories. This is isolation, and it's working. The Ukrainian fireballs don't even have to be inside Crimea itself for the Russian occupiers on the peninsula to feel the pain. What Ukraine is doing now is far more intelligent than simply battering Crimea with missiles and drones, though it still does plenty of that too. We saw that on the night of strikes against 50 Russian vehicles and 4 land routes, as the puppet governor of the Crimean port city of Sevastopol, Mikhail Razvazayev, claimed that air defenses at the port had shot down 32 drones between 10 p.m. and midnight on June 11th. If we know Russia, shot down means that at least some of those drones struck targets. But when it comes to the Crimean land routes, Ukraine is engaged in a methodical and well-calculated campaign. For Ukraine, the war against Russia will never truly be over until Crimea is reclaimed. But a direct strike against the peninsula is suicidal, even this deep into the war, when Russia has spent 4 years depleting itself as it smashes its teeth against Ukraine's defenses. So Ukraine strikes from range, in Crimea, around Crimea, against every single logistical artery that keeps the peninsula supplied. As more roads go down, bridges are destroyed and vehicles burn, the ammunition, fuel, equipment and supplies that flow between Crimea and the occupied territories grinds to a halt. This is the brilliance of Ukraine's strategy. It doesn't need to force Russia out by sending soldiers. Ukraine is making the very idea of holding Crimea untenable for Putin. And right now, Russia's grasp on Crimea is weaker than it's been since it first occupied the peninsula, as the pain of Ukraine's mid-range strikes spreads. Ukraine has created a logistics lockdown using mid-strike drones, including the US-made Hornet, which has a range of about 150 kilometers. These drones are on continual search and strike operations as they hover over Russian supply routes, ready to take out targets. Other drones are starting to emerge, such as the Morrigan, which can launch without a runway, allowing Ukraine to respond even faster to opportunities while creating less risk for the country's drone operators. We've seen the impact on the R280, where Russian military traffic has been reduced to a crawl, but Ukraine's mid-range drones are also causing problems in other occupied regions, such as Luhansk. There, Ukraine's 3rd Army Corps launched an aerial campaign that has essentially given them control over large portions of the skies above one of the most critical regions in the Donbass. That control is allowing the Corps to carry out strikes similar to those we're seeing on the land bridges that connect Crimea to the Ukrainian mainland. Trucks and roads are being taken out all over occupied Ukraine. The impact on frontline soldiers is that they're not getting what they need to launch the record-breaking numbers of assaults that Putin believes will deliver the Donbass to Russia in the summer. Back in Crimea, 50 trucks going down in Armyansk, along with the hundreds that Ukraine is destroying all over the occupied territories every day, is manifesting in massive fuel shortages. This is pain brought to the Russian people occupying the peninsula without Ukraine having to strike them directly. In a June 11th report published just hours before Ukraine devastated vehicles in Armyansk, Reuters said that fuel stations across Crimea had run dry as a direct result of Ukraine's logistical lockdown campaign against Russia's fuel trucks. The outlet claims that witnesses on the ground in Sevastopol report that gas stations aren't just rationing fuel anymore, they've run out entirely, with the last station standing being in the resort town of Yevpatoria. It won't be long before that gas station runs dry as well. And when it does, Crimea's civilians will find themselves unable to work or travel, which will massively disrupt daily life on the peninsula. The situation in Crimea has been known for a couple of weeks now, But as Ukraine keeps hitting Russian logistics, fuel shortages are spreading. According to the Kyiv Post, fuel shortages are now being reported in around a dozen of Russia's regions. There's no systemic problem, Moscow claims. But there is. Ukraine is battering Russia's fuel supplies by taking out trucks all over the occupied territories. Russia's fuel crisis is intensifying, the BBC reported on June 8th, and locals in Crimea are starting to do what Putin never wants them to do, speaking up about the damage that Ukraine is doing. I walk to work now. Of course, this is less convenient than driving, but not a huge problem. All I've got to do now is buy a horse, the BBC reports one resident of the city of Simferopol saying, with their tongue firmly planted in their cheek. Congratulations, Putin. You have your people aspiring toward medieval forms of transportation. Even one of the most important sources of revenue for the Crimean Peninsula isn't drawing in what it should. Tourism to the peninsula is on the wane, and a huge part of the reason why is that travelers don't know if they'll be able to get around Crimea once they arrive. In a June 11th report, Novaya Gazeta revealed that every 2 bookings for trips to Crimea are offset by 10 cancellations. Hotel reservations have declined by a third, with cancellations rising by 79%. The cars, buses and trains that shuttle people into Crimea every year can't be trusted to run anymore, so Russian tourists are abandoning the peninsula in droves. Why does that matter? Well, for Russia, summer tourism in Crimea is a critical part of the narrative that Putin wants to spin about the peninsula. When civilians flock to Crimea to enjoy the coast and warm weather, Russia gets to pretend that the situation in Crimea is normalized, that Russia has so much control that its people feel safe to be there, even after more than 4 years of war with Ukraine. The propaganda machine churns and the illusion is created. But as tourists abandon their Crimean vacation plans, the illusion shatters. On the tactical level, Ukraine's strikes are about stripping away Russia's control over the Crimea by isolating the peninsula. But it's these types of propaganda victories that drive the point home. Slowly but surely, Putin's grip on the peninsula he illegally annexed in 2014 is slipping, and we can see the loss of control on Russian state TV. According to the Kyiv Post, pro-Kremlin propagandists on Russian state TV now feel compelled to address the situation in Crimea. Vladimir Solovyov, who has long been one of Putin's biggest supporters, told his viewers live that Ukraine is actively cutting Russian logistics to the peninsula. Solovyov is panicking. He believes that a large-scale amphibious landing could be coming for Crimea that could deliver a devastating shock to the entire Russian system. Whether that landing comes or not does not really matter. What does matter is the panic poisoning the propaganda. What Putin has to accept now is that the peninsula that he has so long paraded as a trophy has transformed into a noose around his neck. Every time that Ukraine destroys a bridge or hits a supply vehicle heading to Crimea, that noose tightens. Now Putin has an impossible choice. Does he keep his head in the noose and choke, just like the supply lines serving occupied Crimea, or does he yank his head out and give up control over the peninsula? Putin has to decide fast. Ukraine isn't going to stop its mid-range strikes as it continues its strategy to isolate Crimea to force a Russian withdrawal. There's one thing that we know for sure: 1.5 million occupiers in Crimea are regretting their decisions right now. The warning shot that came against the Chonhar bridge ahead of Ukraine's June 11th strikes should have been heeded. You can find out more about Ukraine's initial strikes against the bridge, along with the brand new drone that was the superstar of the show, by watching our report. And if you enjoyed this video, remember to subscribe to the Military Show so you don't miss what we have coming next. And thank you, as always, for watching.